Well, a very good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where in the world that you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Callum Akehurst Ryan this evening, who I've actually worked with in the past. We worked together at a financial services organisation, and by complete chance, happened to be having a conversation on social media quite recently about a very broad set of topics around diversity and inclusion. And I found out that Callum's actually presented on this topic before, which is fantastic. In fact, many times has presented on it before. And I thought this would be an interesting topic for us in the business analysis community as well. So before we get started, just a little bit about Callum. So Callum is a senior test engineer with 11 years of experience across a whole range of domains, from finance to public safety. His technical skills and keen interest in exploratory testing techniques are backed up with a passion for team engagement and the advocation for the integration of testers into agile teams. Using his background in psychology, Callum has recently been engaging teams with quality narratives surrounding human factors, providing insights on how individual and diverse users will engage and experience their products in different ways. And in his spare time, he's also a kick-ass dungeon master. So very, very well-rounded and fun person to be around. So with a presentation entitled How Diversity and Inclusion Help Analysis and Testing, Callum, over to you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. The human side of development, I've called it as well, just for a bit of fun. But who am I? Adrian really kindly gave me a bit of an introduction, but like I said, I'm a senior tester at Scott Logic. I'm a certified human, so I'm good at speaking about, human factors. And I've worked across a number of industries, including finance, banking, and retail. Because I've got a degree in psychology. I think Adrian mentioned that. I've got a real interest in personality and also human factors. So in agile development, and especially within testing, but also within probably within business analysis as well, the pendulum has definitely swung towards people being well-rounded, and that means that we've swung definitely towards engineering, with teams being generalists, and thus usually meaning that we cut out the business side of things and we focus on bringing people with engineering skills into teams. And we find that conferences and blogs that are being written in the agile world are increasingly focused on technology. One thing that I'm finding as well is that agile teams are looking for developers in test rather than testers with business analysis skills or business analysts. We look to find those people that have a strong engineering background. And we then start to see things like an automate everything approach, where everything is automated, everything is engineered and mechanical, rather than having the human side of things. And the reason for that really is just because as technology has increased, as agility in teams has increased, we start to look more for these T-shaped people where they've got like a specialism, but they're generalists. So you start to look for developers that can do a bit of everything, because it's cheaper, effectively. But what this can lead to is the prevalence of an engineering monoculture. We find that women are increasingly put off by all the technology job adverts, that there's a people like us mentality when developers are asked to hire into teams, and that there's a drive towards logic in decision making rather than human factors, and that puts people off and drives people out of teams. It also means that there's an assumed inclusion of engineering backgrounds, making it hard for people to engage. They won't take the time to explain things. And this monoculture starts to prevail, and it's problematic for us because if we start to base our designs and quality on the same biases as each other, because we've all got that same monoculture background, then certain opportunities and issues won't be identified or addressed. So one heuristic, one way of thinking that we can all use when designing a product is our own life experiences. So the easiest things, and this comes into testing as well, just to turn around and say, would I like to use this product? How would I like to use it? So you can bring in an insight about the product and how it will be used in the real world, just from how you think, how you act. And everybody's got a unique perspective based on their own background and their own life experiences. They can bring additional insights to product design. So that means not just relying on a spec or the code to say what's right, not just agreeing with everyone else in the room, but saying, no, I've got an opinion, I've got experiences, I can say something here. One way that I can relate that back to things is when you think about running a retrospective for your team. Everybody's got like a unique insight and can bring something to the table. So the same can be used for design and also testing of software. And being able to bring in different individual takes on things means that are shaped by their own people's own unique experience, means that we can develop what I call socially informed solutions. So solutions, products that are designed based on society in general. By having different viewpoints on something, you can sort of make it better for everyone. So what that means is that people bringing their own individual take on things, diversity will lead to better products. Bringing diversity into the workforce and our teams and our agile teams means that we can share our life experiences, different life experiences from each other. And that will have an overall net effect of increasing our empathy of our user base. If we all start to bring in our own individual takes as to whether or not we would like a product or how we would like to use it, that means that we've got more than just one way, one monoculture way of looking at things. And we start to sort of get a product that more and more people would like to use. And empathy for different types of people can help us think about different aspects of the design. So thinking about things like usability, thinking about things like accessibility, understandability, and just whether or not people would like to actually engage with this product as well. So it's a really important thing. So as a gay man within the technology industry, just as an example, I've been able to identify some issues that weren't thought about by my colleagues. Excuse me. So one of the financial service companies that I worked for had a new website that advertised using their services for a wedding. Save up to pay for your daughter's wedding. And I publicly commented on an internal project page, it wasn't my external, to say, it's disappointing that we haven't taken the opportunity to include civil partnerships as part of this campaign, which is a protected characteristic. Now, within the next day, I was speaking to the CEO of the company, and a load of lawyers were brought down, but they did, they thanked me and they did change the product. And that was just something that, because I have a civil partnership, I was easily able to recognize and notice was something that was missing from their design of their, their fully developed and out there product. Similarly, pension schemes. I've been a member of a number of them, and the options to include weddings and spouses were the only things available. I said, well, what about civil partnerships? What about civil partners? And again, these things got included to the product as a result. Now, other people could have found these issues very easily, but because it's based around my life experience and it was something that I was able to see, I was able to really quickly sort of spot that as a flaw in the design and able to sort of suggest that we move things on like that. So because they're front of mind for me, they're easier to spot. But like I said, other people would be able to think about these things. So I, for example, am quite able-bodied, but I'm able to test for things like accessibility. I do a lot of learning about and think about empathy for people with different needs of a product, and which allows me to think of how to design and test for these things. So similarly, with a social aspect, you're able to talk talk to other people, learn about them, and bring the knowledge of what those people, what their lives are, and what their experiences are to the design of your product. But that's not always very easy. Just to give you a bit of a discussion on a time when I wasn't able to bring myself to a team, and other people this might resonate with them as well. I've, as a tester, it's my role to present information to a team that's not always, good news. And I've always tried to use empathy and have a really friendly human connection with people, in order to sort of make it seem like I'm not the bad guy when I'm giving bad news about a product or a release, which means usually trying to be quite authentic. You can probably hear from my voice that, it's a bit theatrical, and I use a lot of hand motions, which you probably can't see because I haven't got my camera on. But because of that, I've had managers in the past, when they don't want to listen to what I'm saying, try and shut me down, or teams shut me down for being too emotional. And it's a quick way to ignore someone and delegitimize their contributions to a team. They say, like, you're not logical, you're being too emotional, you can't get involved in this. And I'm basically being dismissed because of my life experiences, because, I'm a bit theatrical, I'm a bit camp, I'm gay, rather than being engaged with in the ways that I can bring something to the team. And that's not something that's isolated just to me. I've spoken to a number of women in the IT sector, and heard similar stories where, they've had contributions they've made be dismissed because they were too emotional. And there was that paper written in 2017 in August. It was in the news by a Google engineer that painted a picture of women not being able to contribute to engineering because they had too much emotional intelligence to succeed. So things like this show that there's still a lot of work to do to bring people on a journey towards embracing other people's life experiences and the differences that they can bring to a team, and diversity in general. And it's not limited to just protected characteristics. I talked about my experiences there, being someone LGBT, but we should also think about things like introvert versus extrovert. In a monoculture, in one way of thinking about things, traditionally, when we talk about getting ahead or doing well in an agile team, usually it's extroverts that do better than introverts. So are we just ignoring the contributions of our more introverted colleagues? I spoke to somebody who they dressed quite punky, a bit cyberpunk, and they were told by their team or by their management that they had to start dressing in a polo shirt and conform in behavior just to get ahead. And this is like, putting in dress codes for women to say you have to wear heels and a skirt in the office. Even when there's no like official dress code, it's just a way of de-individualizing people and forcing them to submit to this monoculture. And that, it impacts people's confidence. It means that they can't bring their authentic self and their individuality into their work. It's energy consuming for people because if they're trying to mask who they are or fit in with a monoculture, they can't spend a lot of their energy when it comes to actually designing solutions because they're trying to worry about like how other people will perceive them. So it's going to have a big impact on work. And frequently, we're basically just told that it's unprofessional to bring your individual self to work. And that reduces diversity within not just your team and your workforce, but in development. Because if you can't bring yourself and your ideas and things that make you unique, you're less likely to put forward different design ideas for people. is this view that there's a correct way to think, and that may come from like architects or an engineering culture that says, oh, we all went to one university, we all went and learned this one way of doing things, we all use this one language when designing something, we all use these services when we do, or this tool when we do. So a lack of diversity in a team or in a workforce can be really problematic for design and for quality of products. So how can we improve diversity within a workforce so that we can get the benefits of everybody's unique experiences, so that we can drive out socially informed solutions? So there's things at a business level that we can do, of course, that should be addressed. So supporting diversity and inclusion initiatives in the workplace, ensuring that job adverts use language that's appealing for more than one type of person, not having a scattergun approach and saying all the languages ever, because we know that different groups of people are less likely to blag it, and they're actually going to be a bit more thoughtful about their application process. Creating an environment that's more pleasant for a diverse group of people, so cutting out pub culture, having more flexible working hours, having decor that isn't very overly masculine, for example, or even just thinking about temperature in an office. If you always keep it really cold, you're going to make it so that certain people that run to a different temperature just want to leave. And also training people on their own biases and how to interact with people and different types of people to engage empathy, and to not have a people like us culture when it comes to hiring. And for ourselves, what we can also do within our teams and within software development, we have to point out when behaviours are not working or can be improved. So challenging colleagues to be more diverse in their thinking. Pointing out when everyone's behaving like there's no other options available, and thinking about other ways that we can consider different options. We can all try to bring our authentic self, emotions and all, so that we're not washed along in a tide of like the same people having the same thoughts, and we can support our other colleagues who do that as well. We should support people's diverse viewpoints, giving them consideration and respect. We can use yes and to sort of drive those out, especially when it comes to designing. And we should educate ourselves on diversity and inclusion, educate ourselves on different topics so that we can learn to think like different people, how to work with those people, but also how to design things for those people as well. Effectively, what I'm calling out here is that we need to smash monoculture. We need to spot when everybody's thinking in the same way, when everybody's behaving the same way, when there's an assumed correct solution for something. We need to stop and go out there and smash that preconception. Bring in other ideas as much as possible. And that's all I had to say on the subject. So I'll open up to Q&A, I think.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Callum, for a really interesting talk and a really interesting tour of some of the some considerations that we should all keep in mind on what is a very, very, very broad and diverse topic itself. So if you do have a question for Callum, please do type it in the Q&A window, as I can see some of you are, and we'll cover as many as we can before the close of the session. Okay, so first question, Callum, is it says, in analysis, people start to think about security by design. Listening to you, we should have diversity and inclusion by design as well. What do you think is, if you're an analyst and you're in a monoculture, would it help to use a diverse set of personas to include this in your analysis and design? So I love that idea of diversity and inclusion by design. That's a great A great soundbite.
That's
But what
great, and I may steal it.
repurpose.
Yeah, oh,
What's there?
sorry, yeah. Um, Definitely. Personas are a really great way to do this. So I talked about having empathy for different types of people. If you're the sort of person that finds it easier to come to a design session with ideas already formed, having initially thought of some personas that you can bring to the table would really help with that. To say, Sandra is, a 47-year-old blind woman. How would she use this product? Or, Francis here is a non-binary individual. How would they think about the wording that's being used here? Rather than having to come up with these things on the fly and do all your empathizing with your user base, which is going to be infinite and massive in its scope. You can definitely use personas to do some of that thinking in advance. It's a bit of cognitive offloading for you. So then you can use those to drive things out. In risk analysis in testing, we have this idea of risk storming, and there are cards, persona cards, that we use to think about risks related to things when we're designing them. We could do the same for accessibility, or for socially informed solution, or by diversity and inclusion by design at that point as well. So I'd definitely advocate for that. If you don't have the people around you to sort of spark those ideas, anything you can use as a sort of jumping off point for your designs.
Definitely. And it's interesting because, hearing you talk about that, Callum, it occurs to me that there are so many, the variety and variability of humans is almost infinite.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, the design of anything is a really tough challenge. And if you think about just some of the things we've talked about in this webinar, we've talked about, we've talked about gender. We've talked about non-binary. We've talked about GLBT. We've talked about disability or differently abled people. We could go as far as then saying, well, it may be age, it may be dementia, there may be a whole range of different characteristics that people have that mean that they have different needs when accessing a service. So how do we, if we were formulating personas, or if we wanted to make a really usable service or product or whatever, how do we know we've covered everyone?
Yeah, and because it's kind of infinite, it's difficult to do that. It's worth noting as well, because we talked then about government protected characteristics.
Yeah.
There's other things as well, just such as personal taste, or likes and dislikes, or introvert, extrovert, different things like that. So everybody has things. It's not just the people who who are protected by government kind of thing.
Yeah.
So but to come back to what you were saying there, definitely the best way to do it is just to educate yourself on different types of people, and just think about that as much as possible. Read around the topics of diversity and what types of people there are out there, because what you don't know makes it really difficult to help you on this journey. You need to sort of move the level of information that you have away from I've got no clue to, okay, I've done some reading and now I know that there are these types of people that have these types of likes and dislikes, or these needs when designing for something. Having people around you that act in their authentic self will help as well, because naturally you'll start to see behaviors that may be different from your own, and that's just going to increase empathy. And also thinking about not compartmentalizing. If you're like me, sometimes you have a tendency to compartmentalize your work life and your home life. So you'd forget to think about your friends and what they like and don't like, and all the different characteristics they have when you're in the office. And you can use any person you've met to drive up your empathy. Think about them as a user of this product. Another thing that I found that's really useful, and it's a bit like The Apprentice, is to use focus groups. when you go to a product, when you've got a new product, and you do any user acceptance testing, market research, focus groups, anything like that, squirrel away any information about what the different types of people that are involved in that, because you can then use that going forward, turn them into personas. Like, oh, this was a person that was very brash. They didn't like this. They didn't like this. They were colorblind, so they couldn't get this information. Use that and take it forwards, because you can just start building like this really good portfolio of things. And then I've got a stack of cards on my desk with different personas on them, and there's probably about 50 of them or so. And I'll just shuffle through them and just pick one. Think about the product with them in mind at that point.
That's fantastic. I love that idea of a deck of cards, which just as a thinking tool for for any particular product or service that we're working on. And it's interesting. We had a comment come through that says it's kind of silly that we're constantly trying to define a one-size-fits-all solution for an immense diverse population. Maybe we should start designing different routes or solutions, because there is no one-size-fits-all. So design for variability.
Yeah, no, I was talking about progressive web apps, which is it's basically a type of application that looks like an installed app on your phone, but it's just run from the browser. Okay. And those require a really high level of network speed to work, because there's a lot of it looks nice. There's a lot of design going on it, but because of that, you have to ensure that you create multiple versions of the tool, the app, for different countries, because there are countries out there that are using less than 3G. There are people out there that can only get connectivity once a month, all sorts of things like that. So there are apps out there, things like Spotify, Facebook, and so on, that simultaneously develop and support multiple versions of an application out of technological necessity and infrastructure. But we could expand that out to say, well, why not for different types of people that are out there?
Yeah,
different cultural, different like and dislike. Now, some of that's not going to be financially viable, but some of it is. Or even if you put things into your apps to make them customizable.
Yeah.
So thinking about adding more customizability. When we talk about accessibility for products, in order to reach that top AAA rating from the WCAG, the Web Accessibility Guidelines, your app or tool should have the ability to skin or configure, basically, so that people can change it based on their needs and their desires. Do you remember, this is showing how old I am, there was a music player called Winamp?
Yes, I remember
a while back. Yeah, that was completely open source, and it was skinnable and customizable, and it just allowed people to bring that in. And we were doing that, back in the advent of back in the thousands or the late 90s. So we should be able to still do that today.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we're talking about different needs and different personas and so on, there's then the sort of marketing element of personas. And I don't know if you found the same, Callum, but one thing I've found is that personas are useful when they're based on some thought and insight or data or whatever. But sometimes I've been in places where it's been like, oh well, this is the millennial, and there's this sort of stereotypical millennial that doesn't really exist. And I've personally struggled with this idea that anyone that's born within a 15-year window is the same. And I sort of think, well, actually, if that's someone who, say, for example, grew up in the care system and then aged 18, were out on their own, that they probably had quite a different life experience to someone who went to private school. And if they were from a different part of the world, they were different. So some of these shortcuts that are useful in marketing are perhaps less useful for us in design. Would you agree with that, or would you take a different view?
No, I would definitely agree. So one of the slides I was talking about de-individualization. Attempts to remove what makes somebody unique and make them conform to a monoculture. So when we're talking in engineering circles, in agile teams, that's taking your skill set, your insights, and what makes you have that unique viewpoint, and sort of belittling it and shoving it down and making you conform to that sort of engineering or development team member kind of standard. And it's the same thing here with personas. If you basically try to shove people into like this one box of a very limited view, you're de-individualizing them, you're reducing that viewpoint and of what makes people people, and only catering for something that doesn't even exist effectively. So we should again be pushing against, especially in design and in marketing, pushing against that, away from those sorts of things, and thinking more towards having empathy for as many different types of people as we can.
Definitely. Okay, so our next question is around practical steps. So the question is, if someone finds themselves in a monoculture and they want to single-handedly challenge it, difficult question. What steps can they take? And any advice for someone in that situation?
Yeah, so this is something that I've done in the past. And the way I've gone about these sorts of things, first of all, coming in as somebody that isn't an engineer, is to really make it evident in a friendly and positive way that I'm not the same. So I will say, give me baby's first steps on what you mean by this. I'm not an engineer. I've got a different background. Let me know. How we can do, learn. Wow, that sentence got away from me. Let me know how I can learn from you in this situation. That's one thing you can do, just to call it out. Start calling things out. Another thing you can do with people like to feel very listened to. So if you pair with somebody, sit with them and take some of their insight while sharing some of your insights, you get quite a lot of leeway with people, and you start to tease these things out, and you can spread that view across different things. So if you're doing like design and analysis, bringing in different people into, say, like Three Amigos, and asking for and trying to really take the time to understand what they mean by some of the engineering sort of thoughts, and say, oh, what drove you to that decision? What were your thoughts on that? And just trying to facilitate a discussion whilst also learning about it is going to help, because then people will innately start to think, oh, I kind of owe them one, and then they'll listen to you because they owe you one.
Yeah, the sort of law of reciprocity, or however the word's pronounced. But interesting, and there's a short follow-up question which I'll sort of embellish a little bit and add to. So the question is, how much of this is cultural? And I'll add to an interpretation to that, to say I've certainly, as I'm sure you have, Callum, worked in places where perhaps the underlying narrative is one of like almost like military conflict. So people talk about competition and winning, and we've got to shoot them down and win the war and these sorts of things. So the narrative and the language is almost very military, and that culturally can lead to a certain type of toxicity, at least in my experience. I'm sure it's not the same everywhere, but it can lead to quite a what some might describe as macho culture, with a lot of people trying to sort of outdo everyone else. So in your experiences, is some of this cultural? Is some of it cultural? And like if there is if there's a lot of that machoism going on, is it possible to start to interject empathy?
Yeah, so what you tend to find is, yes, definitely. There's and we're talking cultural as in to an organization rather than national.
Yes.
So yeah, definitely. So what you find is some of these organizations will have especially when hiring, there'll be a people like us mentality towards the hiring. And that means that you end up with people that do think alike in certain roles anyway. And especially if you've got like, I've worked at places where you've got a lot of Cambridge graduates, and they have an innate bias towards other Cambridge graduates, which means you end up with a lot of people with shared experiences and one way of thinking. And it can be quite difficult to get into that, and to sort of help to move that culture away. And the ways to do it, I've found, or the ways that have been the most successful to do it, are to do things that are engaging and positive for everyone. So firstly, to talk about these groups and this culture and how they have something to bring to the table as well. We're not talking about trying to say that people can't be, part of that culture. We're not saying that you can't be a man in this industry at all. We're talking about how to get more people able to bring in individual views and thoughts to things. We're talking about how they themselves can bring more to the table and bring more of themselves to the table, because there's always things that people don't bring to work. Especially when I'm talking to engineers specifically, I talk to them about introvert versus extrovert, because you tend to find that business people can be more extrovert or more in that way, and engineering mindset tends to be more thoughtful and introvert. So we talk about a lot of these sorts of things to win people over initially as well. When we talk about hiring strategy or allowing people into teams, you have to get around mindsets of people going like, oh, why should we lower our standards to let X type of person into a team? And you say, it's not about that. It's about making us more attractive, so that really kick-ass women, gay people, people from other nationalities want to join this team, so that we can cherry pick the best people effectively. And that the best doesn't just mean that they know how to write Java in Dvorak. It means that, there's other things as well. And in order to help battle against, basic things like just like that monoculture, and you talked about like that masculine, like one kind of viewpoint. I've set up a diversity and inclusion initiative where I work currently, and we've run different events for different types of days. So we hosted a techie brekkie for International Women's Day, where we talked about different women in engineering. We talked about Ada Lovelace, and we supported, the women that we work with, and asked them to share their insights of working in our office. We did some stuff for Pride, where we talked about and shared experiences with all of our colleagues about how it was being LGBTQ in our office. And we hosted a bake sale to raise money for local gay charities in the different sites that we have. We've just run an international day. We found out that some of our colleagues were really put off by the fact that when we talk about our childhood, when we talk about the sweets we used to eat or the TV shows we used to watch, they didn't do that, so they felt quite excluded. So we had a day where they were able to share like parts of their childhood and just make people more aware that these how these sorts of discussions can be quite isolating for people. So doing things like that, making it really positive, giving it like a festive atmosphere, really helps to sort of cut into that, because you're doing something positive and you're not telling somebody, oh, no, you've been bad, you've been this type of person. And it's not about that. It's about bringing everyone on board.
Yeah, bringing everyone on board, and that really resonates, what you were saying there, Callum, about actually almost enabling, cultivating a culture where people can actually put their hand up and say, oh, well, I don't understand your shared references from sort of 80s TV on a Saturday morning, but I'd like to learn more, and actually maybe you could learn more about my history, and we could have that conversation, and then we'd be a richer team together. That's a really nice idea. I suppose, and I'm thinking on my feet here, there's an element of also calling out situations where people use language that they might not know is offensive, but actually is offensive. I know this is something I'm known to do from time to time.
Yeah, and not even just offensive. Like I've worked in very tech savvy teams, and especially as a tester, because I have to know a lot of the technical side of things, but I also have to know a lot of the business side of things. I would be the person that translated for our product owner and say, oh, this means this, or what that means for the business is it's going to impact this and this and this. So just taking the time in any given meeting to not just assume that everybody's on the same page. If you've got that knowledge, or then to give it a bit more information so that other people can follow as well, make sure everyone's on board, or even be the person to raise up your hand and say, what does that mean? No idea.
Mm.
Because it's not a bad thing to not know something.
Yes.
That we have to be able to, and sometimes monocultures can make us feel that way, make us feel stupid or lesser because we're
Yeah,
not we don't know something. But it might just be that we haven't had exposure to that sort of thing, or it hasn't to date been part of our role to know these sorts of things. But and now that it is, or it's tangential, or it will help us to decide something, we can call these things out.
definitely. Okay, so our next question is, could you share a few techniques which could help a monoculture team to think outside the box about a diverse user or stakeholder group? So I think this is specifically about if there was a persona or some personas that we wanted to address, how could we brainstorm or think about ways of designing for those personas? Any techniques or tips?
Interesting.
Hmm.
So there's a really good thing. The Ministry of Testing has a risk storming technique that you can look up if you Google for the Ministry of Testing risk storming. It's a really cool deck of cards made by TestSphere, and it has a lot of personas in it. But effectively, it's gamifying the concept of design. And what you do is you put your product in the middle of this of a board, and around it you put different risks or different potential risks or different users, and then from there you can start to build this like really good picture of how to start mitigating these things. Use post-its to mitigate for these different users and so on.
Mm.
And when you do that enough times, you start internalizing. It becomes a heuristic rather than a game that you play. But that's a really good one that I found because it's gamified. With a deck of cards and with post-its, which lots of people do in retros anyway, it's a really good way of doing that and starting to think about these sorts of things and ideas as well. Another thing you can do if you're finding it difficult to empathize with different types of people straight away, because accessibility is like the one that we usually think about, you can blindfold yourself or attach weights to your wrist to think about like having older, slower motions. Try living or try using a product like a similar product to start to build up that empathy as well is a good technique just for yourself, as well as reading about different D&I initiatives so that you can start thinking about things like that.
Yeah, I remember once about probably 10 or 15 years ago, I injured my foot
Mm.
to the point where I was in real pain when I was walking, and I could it was taking me perhaps to walk to the end of the road where I was living at the time 15 minutes, where it would have normally taken me about 3. And
Yeah.
I suddenly had this realization of, oh wow, this is what it's like to and actually you kind of, I think that first-hand experience, or even simulating that first-hand experience, makes you realize, oh, okay, when that person's in my way, they're not trying to be in my way,
Yeah.
and actually that you start to realize, for example, there are steps everywhere that you don't normally notice. You're like, wow, there are steps everywhere. It's
Mm.
like if you ever injure a leg and try and go on the London Underground, you're like, oh, there are steps, you go down and then up and down again. It's insane, but you just kind of, it's almost like cognitive blindness, isn't it? When until you think about it. So fantastic. Well, Callum, I'm sure we could continue for hours, but we're reaching the end of our allotted
Yeah.
time.
I'll give you.
So I have no doubt that people will want to stay in touch. They'll want to follow you. I mean, how can people stay in touch? What's the best way of people to keep up to date with your work?
Yep. So my name is very unique. It's an old English name, meaning I pretentiously double-barreled after marrying. So you can easily find me. I have a blog that I write some things about on there. The Scott Logic website blog. I have some things that I talk about there as well, or LinkedIn. I'm all over LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy. I've spoken to a fair few people and given them some tips and tricks in the past as well. So yeah, you can. yeah, easily find me. There's even a YouTube video where I did some really bad acting in.
Bad acting. Well, now this is
Yeah,
interesting. I'm going to have to Google this. What was the
don't.
context?
It's so terrible.
Fantastic. Well, Callum, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about what is such an important topic, and one that I think, well, I mean, you've mentioned it in the testing community. I think in the BA community as well, we've got an ethical imperative, I would argue, to think about these things, and sometimes to perhaps be the voice of the person that's not being considered, to put a voice to that persona that's not being considered, and make sure no voices are marginalised. So it's really, really thought-provoking. So thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you also to everyone who has tuned in live, and indeed anyone who's watching the recording. As a reminder, this is part of a sort of BA community webinar series. So the aim is to cover topics that perhaps are not on our radar yet, or perhaps not as firmly on our radar as they should be. So if you are listening live or you're watching the recording and there's a topic that you think we ought to cover, please do get in touch with me by email, Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever, and we will definitely try and make that happen. There is a webinar tentatively scheduled for next month. I'm just getting the final details in at the moment, but I'm hoping we'll get Kevin Brennan to talk to us about product management. So fingers crossed that will come together. So thanks again, Callum, for a fantastic presentation. Thanks everyone for tuning in. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world, and hope to see you all again soon. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.